This is the Cloud Ace podcast, bringing you the latest in cloud security through captivating chats with fascinating cybersecurity experts who are leaving their mark on the industry. Cloud Ace is brought to you by the SANS Institute and hosted by SANS certified instructor Brandon Evans. And now, prepare for departure. We're cleared for takeoff. Here's your captain, Brandon Evans.
Today, I'm happy to reunite with my former coworker at Asurion, Jabez Abraham. Jabez is a titan of the Nashville cybersecurity scene. He has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to launch Serverless Days Nashville, an incredible conference where industry leaders discuss how serverless is changing how we use the cloud for better or for worse. I had the great pleasure of speaking at the first Serverless Days Nashville event in 2020, which was a huge gathering. Now, you may remember, I just said 2020, huge gathering. This was in the beginning of the year. A few weeks later, the world was completely locked down. So subsequent Serverless Days Nashville's events have been run virtually. But I'm really looking forward to when we can all meet in person to discuss serverless in the near future. Jabez is currently a senior cybersecurity cloud architect at Paige, responsible for AWS IAM and SSO, container security, and compliance for an organization aiming to improve the medical diagnosis process. Prior to that, we worked together at Asurion, where we helped our hundreds of developers use AWS, Azure, and GCP securely. And before that, Jabez has helped Change Healthcare, Embedion, and many other organizations secure their clouds and code. So I am so excited to discuss his impressive career in the cloud and gain insights from him in this session. Jabez, welcome.
Thanks, Brandon. That was quite an intro. I do appreciate all of that. I'm really excited to be part of this podcast and just share things that I'm passionate about, just to help the community, help teams adapt to the changing environment. We've seen that quite a bit in the recent years, and really looking forward to being part of this event. Thank you for inviting me and having me.
Most certainly. You're a very knowledgeable person in this field, and I could not see this podcast without you. So tell us a little bit about what your career was like before the cloud started getting adopted by your employers, because I know that you've been in this game for quite some time, longer than I have.
Sure. So just to kind of go back to recent history before the cloud, as you mentioned, I think where I started was primarily in the system administration and mail administration, and a lot of those low-level type of work where you're really dealing with kind of the systems from a perspective of managing software, managing hardware, managing deployments, and keep the upkeep of the system, production support. So I've kind of run the whole gamut of from on-call to making sure that the systems are running with data center migrations and multiple other areas that comes with it, right? So that's kind of where I started from that area, and slowly started morphing into the inevitability of having security, right? You're dealing with production applications, production deployments, data centers, dealing with the security of the applications, security of the systems themselves. So that's kind of my pre-cloud days, if you want to call it in a nutshell.
Certainly. And I think it's important for folks to recognize that most stories are like that, where you start off in IT and transition into security. I think that for the folks in the audience who may not have any security experience at all, be aware that no one was born a cloud security architect. No one even grew up thinking that they were going to be or wanting to be a cloud security architect. People are starting in various different places. A large number of those people are starting in IT. So it's great to hear that experience that you've had prior to getting into security. So how did things change in that security role as the cloud had gotten bigger and more well adopted by the industry?
So this is more kind of going historical, right? And when I started looking at moving to the cloud, or companies that were moving to the cloud, I can think of the healthcare space that I was part of. And at that time, Amazon was the one that was chosen by the company that I worked for. And we were starting to explore into this, the new thing, the cloud, right? And some people talking about the cloud and the benefits of the cloud and different things. And security, to be honest, at that time was not necessarily at the forefront when you start thinking about the cloud, right? A lot of people are thinking about the business value of the cloud, right? A lot of people are thinking about what is this going to afford when I start not having to worry about paying for a hardware that's going to be hosted 24/7 that I'm not going to use. So a lot of times the business value comes in at the beginning. And then as I started dealing with production support, deploying applications to the cloud, security started becoming an important aspect of it. But a lot of them from an on-premises mindset, right? People have, hey, in on-premises, we have a firewall, so we need a firewall for the cloud. On-premises, we have all of these different network ports that are open. Okay, we need the same thing for the cloud. So it was a very much of a on-premises mindset that tries to get morphed into a cloud environment, which in some cases is okay. But when you really think about it, right, you want to think of cloud as building from the ground up so that you can really understand the benefits and the challenges you're going to face in the cloud that you will not face on premises. Just to give a brief on that, hopefully that helps set the context.
Absolutely. And you've helped a lot of enterprises who are not even necessarily internet first transform into cloud organizations and do so securely. So what are some examples of where the on-prem mindset breaks down in the cloud, especially from a security perspective?
Yeah, that's a very valid area of concern, right? So a lot of times, some of the areas that I've seen personally of this on-prem mindset applying in the cloud that breaks down is, for example, when you start applying additional tools on top of what cloud provides. So, for example, if you have an Amazon security groups, so in security groups, you have access from one system to the other system, one subnet to the other subnet, all of those things. But sometimes the onset mindset can say, hey, I want to have something like Trend Micro on top of it, right? I want to put additional layers of third party that's installed on my instances. So now when I'm trying to troubleshoot an issue of saying I'm not getting traffic from system A to system B, now you're dealing with, is it because of my security groups? Is it because of my routing? Is it because of Trend Micro that's sitting on top of it? Is it because of the application is not behaving the way it's supposed to behave? So now you've just complicated that simple paradigm of saying server A to server B, here's the security group, it's open on port 443, and we're done, right? Rather than that, now you're starting to deal with all of these multiple layers, because on premises, you would have said, I need to install hardware in my data center. Now I have to install all of these other tools on top of it, not realizing that the cloud natively brings a lot of that when you're starting to deploy in the cloud, right? So that aspect of it, if people don't realize that cloud natively has some security features that it comes with because they're building it from that perspective, then the mindset of saying, okay, I have a server in the cloud, now I have to secure it by my own means that I'm used to when I was doing on premises. That's just a simple example, but that can be very painful when you're dealing with cloud environments, which are very dynamic.
Certainly. And I definitely feel that way today, that Amazon, Microsoft, GCP, and others provide a lot of great built-in security capabilities that in a lot of cases replace what we would use on premises. Yes. But that wasn't necessarily where we were at in 2006, right? Yes. Amazon was considered one of the most mature providers at that time. It's still considered one of the most mature. But was it really that mature back in 2006? What additional things did you have to deal with that you no longer have to deal with in AWS?
Yeah, sure. So I would address that in two different perspectives, and if I may. The one perspective is sometimes people don't look at or think about is just the maturity of the market, right? So like you said, 2006, people are starting to invest in the cloud. Then you hear all of these things of, S3 bucket compromise. Not necessarily so, it's just because somebody left it open in the public and somebody downloads a bunch of data that's not supposed to be public. And so you have these things, and a mindset 2006, 2007 started coming as like, the cloud is not secure, right? So that is a mindset that is not necessarily a technical issue. It's more of how do you properly apply the tools that has been given in the cloud and doing it the right way, right? And so that is a challenge that I had to face, meaning, hey, the cloud is not secure. Oh, we cannot do this in the cloud because it's not ready for it in that sense. So that is an aspect that people sometimes forget, where it's not always a technical aspect of it that security becomes a part of. It's more of the people aspect of it, just trying to make sure that we implemented everything we can and being able to show it to upper management that this is done the right way and it is secure. So now, coming to the other aspect of it, from what you had asked, is in 2006, a lot of that, when you think about Amazon especially, a lot of that was built very developer centric, right? Which is true and which still is. But from that perspective, the underlying understanding of a platform that's given to developers is that, hey, here are the different things you have to do to make this work. Okay, that's great. So developers go in and turn this on, turn that off, and do these things. Hey, now I have an authentication framework that I can work with, for example, right? But the additional padding, as it were, that needs to be given for someone who's not a security-focused developer to say, by the way, when you create an S3 bucket, it can be public. There's not going to be any bells and whistles that says that, hey, you're creating this as public, or any other warnings, as it were. And so someone going in and creating something and saying, oh, I expect this to be secure because they told me to follow steps 1, 2, and 3, and they just check box it and then go on and do it, right? So now later on, I started seeing Amazon starting to come out with, if you do this, you're going to expose this to the internet. Are you okay with that? If you click this, it means that this is not private anymore. So they started doing some iterations to make it a little bit more, a little bit more visible on the actions you're taking for some of the work that you're doing, right? And I think that was a maturity that Amazon had to go through, because a lot of publicity was coming out as like, oh, look at this, what happened? Look at that, oh, that was an Amazon, or look at how people compromise this and whatnot. And so I believe that was a shift that I saw from 2006 going forward, where there's a lot more awareness that was created from a person who's going and deploying in the cloud to make it simple, but also not to make it, in a sense, naive, meaning, hey, I don't know, I'm just going to do it, see what happens.
Certainly, there's been a lot of documentation that the cloud providers have provided to help people do things securely. There's a lot of warnings that have been added to the console to say, hey, this is a public bucket. You may want to consider not making it public. And there's also some controls that they even give you, the ability to block all buckets from being public in the first place. And all three cloud providers have a mechanism like that.
Yes.
But when you mentioned those warnings in the AWS console, I still cannot get over this. It's just something that upsets me every time I think about it, is that AWS will give you a warning when you launch a new VM regarding your security groups, regarding your firewall rules.
Sure.
It'll give you a warning saying, hey, we see that your VM is exposed to the public internet over port 22. And that can be dangerous. And Azure does the same thing, completely ignoring that the individual who added that rule to the new VM was AWS. They pre-populated the form with a rule that they then say is bad to use. So I think that's very frustrating for starters, but also an example of how they have to balance these two concerns, usability versus security.
Yes.
They want to help you get up and running with an insecure default so that they use the actual platform, but they will also warn you, hey, this thing that we're telling you to do, don't actually do it.
Yes, you're right. And then also, and you kind of hit the nail on the head with the usability and security, where how much do you give so that the developers don't get frustrated and ignore your platform or go to a different platform? But how much do you warn where someone who may not be savvy about those warnings may ignore, right? Someone says that port 22 is open on the internet. Okay, sure. Well, that's great. I can access it now, right? Not realizing that your service will be compromised within 20, 30 minutes of being on the internet, so potentially. So I guess that's really where it becomes a challenge. Yeah.
Absolutely. Nonetheless, there have been a lot of services that AWS and Azure and GCP and others have launched to make security easier, to either provide scans or visibility tools or all sorts of different things. So in your mind, what are some of the top security services that have been added since 2006 that really changed the game?
Yeah, you're right. There's a few of them. Just at the top of my mind, things that come up. I know Amazon has done a good job with things like Control Tower, for example, right? The Amazon Control Tower, which really gets you an overarching view of how I want to deploy an account. Organizations is another one, right? To say, anytime an account comes up, it's going to attach to the organizations. Now I can do service control policies to say, on a global level, these are the things that I want to allow, like an umbrella protection. Even if a local admin wants to elevate their privileges and say, I want to leave the organization, the global policy takes over and says, oh, no, you can't do that because you're part of an organization and there's a global control policy that says that you cannot exit the organization, right? So I think kind of bringing that end-to-end view of deploying an account with pre-baked protections like the Control Tower does. You've got Security Hub, you got Amazon Config, and then being able to take action on things that it finds. So for example, with Config or Trusted Advisor and other things where you can say, if a bucket comes up, which is not having server-side encryption enabled, flag it, alert it, and if you need to, take action on it, right? Again, the user has to set that up, but you can enforce it where a user may accidentally create a bucket that's not encrypted as per their compliance requirements. But now you've got something that's watching those events that are coming in and then taking action and then applying those server-side encryption automatically without the user having to do it or take action on. So I think some of those proactive way of enforcing those security boundaries that you want to have has been a good progression from the cloud provider's perspective.
Certainly. And you mentioned service control policies, and I think you did a great job at explaining what those are. But IAM can be very, very complicated. And I'll definitely invite folks who are listening right now to, after listening to this session, if you haven't already, check out the IAM panel session that we also have on the podcast to learn a little bit more about the different levels of IAM in these different cloud providers. But a big part of what you mentioned is about how to manage multiple accounts within the AWS organization or your Azure, the group of subscriptions. I think it's a management group or your Google Cloud organization. But a lot of organizations start off their cloud journey in a single account. Yes. And I don't want to give you a horrible flashback right now, Jabez, but we have seen an instance in which an account should have been split up into multiple accounts. And I'm curious what your perspective is about that. Is it okay to have your entire enterprise in one cloud account?
So you're right. There are flashbacks, and you're right. And it's always this challenge between where do you start, draw the line, and then where do you mature at that point, right? Especially even in startups. You think about startups that are just starting to go into the cloud. The question comes, do I get the developers up and running, just give them servers and just give them things that they can develop on and deploy products? Or do I take a step back and have a vision of not necessarily a 10-year plan, as it were, maybe a vision of 1 year from now, 2 years from now, if we're successful, where do I find myself in? Would this be too hard to manage? Would this be something that I need to be aware of? So from that front, I think from personally just looking at some of those challenges and then being able to retrofit right after you go in 6, 7, 8 months and finding out that this is too small and your IP space is running out of IPs and you have all of these other challenges that are there. Companies that are starting from the ground up, right, should have a strategy of saying, we personally, I prefer having multiple accounts, not necessarily based on even business groups, because that can change and things collapse and things expand, but based on functionality. So I would say start off, if you're starting off, I would say for a data lake, I would have definitely a separate account. For my production applications that are maybe more specific to a particular geographical group, like Americas or Europe or whatnot, have a separate footprint in that sense. So trying to break it down, not too granular. Now it becomes a management challenge, but at least to some level, not to start off with just one account and saying we'll figure it out in the future. And now you're having to move large volumes of data and break up those accounts. So it's a hard problem in the sense of someone's just starting, thinking of where they want to go. But I think the time put in the beginning of the implementation will help as the company matures. It's going to protect us. So
I think a big part of that is just making sure that you don't have production infrastructure in the same account as development or
absolutely
QA infrastructure. I think that's a big mistake that people make in the beginning, because development is development, right? Things can go wrong in there. And you want to keep that separate from all of your other infrastructure. But a big part of this, I believe, is infrastructure as code.
Yes.
Because if you keep your account separate, but you need to replicate ideas and concepts that you have in development to production, well, you have two choices, really. You can do it all manually and potentially get everything wrong or make things less secure, or you can codify what those settings are and transition them from one account to the other. So I think a big part of this is ensuring that you use infrastructure and configuration as code from the start, because manually migrating from one account to another or from development to production, you don't want to do it.
Yes.
I can tell you right now, you do not want to do that.
You're absolutely right. And really the blast radius, right? We talk about the blast radius of what can someone do, not necessarily intentionally or maliciously, but accidentally. Someone having access to an account which has maybe your production training data or your production data in an S3 bucket, accidentally going in and saying empty bucket or whatever it may be that it may be, and doing something that's not what they intended, and being able to assign least privilege principle across multiple accounts and what they have access to goes a long way. And you're right. You're right about automation. It's absolutely essential to, especially in the cloud environments with such amounts of ephemeral data that's passing and systems that are coming up and down, being able to manage it in a way that you can go back and do, not just to be able to move from one environment to the other, but to have an audit to say who made this change, when was the change made, was there a change request for it, and then being able to replicate it, right? So to back off the change or to know exactly what changed. So I think all of that plays into it really nicely when you spend that extra effort in automating it. Absolutely.
Hi, AJ here. SANS Cloud Security is building a diverse community of cloud security practitioners, and we'd like to invite you all to participate in our Discord server. This server is meant to be a place for those in cloud security to discuss tradecraft, tools, news of the day, SANS Cloud Security resources, GAC Cloud Security certifications, and anything else cloud security related. Offense, defense, multi-cloud, public cloud, DevSecOps, and more. Everyone wins when we share knowledge and work together, so please make friends, contacts, network, and let's have some fun. Continue your journey in cloud security. Join our Discord at sansurl.com/cloud-discord. That's sansurl.com/CLOUD-DISCORD. Thanks.
And without that automation, it's really hard to take concepts and move them into multiple places. And that leads me to my next question, which is, when we were working together at Assurion, we were responsible for the security of many applications written by literally hundreds of developers over many, many teams. How were you able to provide a cohesive strategy that could be adopted by all of those teams? Did people reuse configuration and infrastructure as code? Was there another method you used? How did you tackle that problem?
So, in especially working with teams, especially like what you said, not only locally but geographically spread out, right? So you're dealing with folks who are working when it's nighttime in the U.S., in other countries and other locations. They have their own compliance requirements that are different than the U.S. So when especially working in that kind of a broad area, I personally think that what really helped is to try to bring people on the same page, not necessarily on the coding languages and here's how you should do this or that, from that perspective, but more from the perspective of having a set of guidelines or standards that people can adapt to, so they can take it and say, okay, I want to secure my sensitive data, maybe PHI data or PII data, those kind of things. What are some ways that I can do it, instead of them trying to search online and trying to find a way to do it, which may be a bad idea at times, or maybe a good idea from some blogger, I guess. But being able to have a cloud center of excellence type location where you're able to go in and say, okay, this is what the security team has done due diligence and published it, right? It's got an information that says that this is published for use and whatnot. Then being able to assimilate it, give them code snippets, give them examples, give them why it's helpful to do it the way you have to do it, and then being able to promote that, right? I think that it's a little bit outside of the normal, where people would say, okay, do this or don't do this, rather than trying to bring them into a place where there's a common framework of a body of documentation that they can go and look at it, right? Now, obviously, we and I had to keep it updated, as things change and as things and move, and work with other teams, and I know we worked on things together as well on a lot of those things. So being able to bring that to a developer and say, hey, here's what is accepted, and here's how you should do what you're trying to do, right? So that way, everybody is not just left to their own kind of thinking of, I think this is good enough. So I think that is very crucial from an organization that's starting to look at dispersed amount of people. They have their own way of doing it. Some people use Go, some people use Python, some people use .NET. Now you have all of these different disparate groups that are doing different things and serving different purposes, but they can be united in, here's how you need to think about security. Here's how we apply least privilege principles. If we're going to use JWT tokens, here's how you do it. So bringing those common areas that can be very detrimental if you do it wrong, and then making sure that we publish something solid that people can take and use, and of course do trainings and different things is key from that perspective, is what I believe.
Yes, and I definitely think one of the most important things you mentioned in there was code snippets, real examples, potentially even packages that they can bring into their application. Because having that documentation is valuable and necessary. But let's be real, not everybody's going to read that documentation.
Yeah.
We need to go beyond having those Confluence documents. We need to have real code snippets, real packages that they can embed right into their application, as well as training resources. That's, people learn in different ways. Some people learn by reading. I know for sure I'm not someone who learns by reading. I learn from live instruction or videos or sometimes audio. So definitely have to apply different approaches to different teams and different individuals as well. One of the big parts of that you mentioned is geographical spread, that we had to deal with a lot of different teams across a lot of different regions. But we also had to deal with customers from different regions. And that brings me to a topic that I really love discussing, and hopefully you'll love discussing too, China. How do we do cloud in China? What are some of the approaches that we can take to securely do cloud in China?
So from the perspective of a location like China, right, like you brought up, the challenge we have is not just on how we want to do it, but how does China want us to do it, right? Even from the implementation perspective, we're not just talking about the privacy of the data, it needs to stay in China, it cannot leave China, those kind of things. And those are there for a lot of countries. So those are standard things. But when we are having to look at areas like, you have to use this provider that Amazon is tied up with, and you have to use this type of algorithm to secure encryption and things like that, then it becomes a very different set of challenges that you face. So to your question about geographic locations, and especially with China, I would say that the least needed information that needs to be put in China, for example, is how I would go. So for example, if I have a software that I'm presenting to the Americas, and I would say, here's the data that I'm presenting, and let's say it's a data lake, and here's what you can get from it, and I'm giving that as an asset for people to be able to query on in that sense. So when I'm dealing with geographic regions, which I know that could be open for other than other entities like government entities and others, for example, right? That's where I would say is that, okay, I'm going to ensure that the data I put there is very streamlined. I'm not going to put for future purposes, okay, I'm going to put large amounts of data, but then I'm going to have an API that's going to only give you a certain subset of the data. But rather, if I go to China, I would say I'm going to just put the subset of the data that is needed for that product. And then tomorrow, if I'm expanding it, I can always add to that subset of the data and present that as something that's available. But I would not put an investment in putting as much as I can so that I can build future releases by opening it up more, right? So it's a little bit of a different mindset, from a place where that the data is not necessarily secure, that nobody can see it, right? Potentially, they can have access to it. Other government entities can have access to it. So that's where I would start rethinking, what am I building? Where am I building? What is the implication of someone actually having access to my data that I don't want, or don't want them to have access to, like a government entity? And we're not talking about hackers, right? And then how do I ensure that that data that I have is available for use, but not necessarily, the data that is not needed, right? So those are some challenging areas that we had to deal with, in that sense, that I would have to deal with.
I think one big takeaway to unify these two different topics is put all of your China stuff in a separate account.
Yes.
Have them communicate with each other as little as possible.
Yes, that's a very fair way of distilling it. I kind of went a little bit around the circle there, but you're right. I think it is definitely imperative, even from a network connection perspective, right? Even direct connect, for that matter, being able to say that network is going to be segregated. It's not going to talk back to another account in the US. Just making sure that those kind of controls, right, that you're completely isolating it in that sense, and not putting excess data that is not needed, right? Because that entity, how secure it is something that that you're not sure about.
And I think a lot of this gets back to compliance as well. You have different organizations with different compliance regimes dealing with different geographies, different governments, et cetera. And I know that you've worked a lot with compliance in its connection to security. What are some of the challenges that you have seen when it comes to dealing with compliance in the cloud? And are there any instances in which cloud actually makes compliance easier?
I'm going to take the second question first, right? Because from the perspective of compliance, one of the areas that's helped when we were dealing with a lot of the global companies, South Korea, Japan, in the Asian countries like Taiwan and some of those countries, or Singapore, so when you're dealing with that, or UK for that matter, the benefit of using the cloud is that they have gone through vigorous compliance approval process for some of the things that they come on GDPR or whatnot, right? So they go through that and say, hey, we are compliant with the local laws of the land, and here's all our compliance certifications. And being able to, I understand that is more for their infrastructure, right? The shared responsibility model, we understand that. But still being able to say, hey, I'm going to host your data in a platform that your country has approved for these compliance certifications, right? So that gives some level of support to say, okay, I'm going to have a BAA agreement. I'm going to have these things on top of it. I'm going to promise that I'm going to use the services that are approved for this type of data, and then I'm going to do it the way that the cloud provider wants me to do it so that I can still be compliant. So it gives you a good framework to be able to know, how do I deploy something in a compliance or a regulated environment and be able to support those, right? So from that perspective, I think the cloud does bring a lot of value to especially someone going in new and saying, okay, I'm in this country and what are the compliance laws, right? So it gives you that benefit of that. From the perspective of the first question that you had of some of the challenges is data moving regions or countries, right? So that is a big area that, for example, if you have a centralized data lake and you say, hey, I'm in the the Asian market, for example, and I have all these different entities that want to query my data, and they're across these multiple countries. Let's say you have a user base in Singapore, but also you have that same user base who could be coming in from Japan, or they could be coming in from Malaysia, for that matter, or Taiwan. Now you're dealing with multiple geolocations and multiple users potentially wanting their data from these different regions that are close together, right? And so that's where it becomes quite interesting, because now can the data leave, but is the user consent? So is it okay? So all of those start coming in play. And of course, legal is involved and all of those things are there. But what does help is to ensure that when from an encryption perspective, from a data management perspective, from retention of data, your caching layer, all of that, being able to solve that. And I think that was one of the big challenges. That was an exciting challenge in that sense. I love to solve problems, but from that perspective, I think it makes it very, very tricky from a compliance perspective.
Most certainly. Data transfer is definitely a big issue when it comes to compliance, and that shared responsibility model is important for people to remember, right? You are not necessarily compliant with these regimes just because AWS, the platform, is compliant with that regime.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yes, you're absolutely right. And so, and it's one of those things where people can get a false sense of security, right? Where people can deploy in an environment that says that, okay, we're FedRAMP compliant, or we're certain compliance in HIPAA and other things, and say, okay, I've deployed it, so I must be HIPAA compliant. So that is a misnomer where people may have that understanding, but really Amazon is compliant. Your data needs to follow these things so that you can also follow similar practices and keep it, in the same realm. So yes, you're right. It is a very, very interesting thing that people have to be aware of.
It's a balancing act for sure, having to understand both sides of the equation.
Absolutely.
Now we have to wrap up, unfortunately. I'd love to catch up with you all day if we could. But one of my final questions for you is regarding organizing a cloud conference. You helped organize Serverless Days Nashville, which I was incredibly impressed with. I thought it was a great event, so many different speakers, so many great topics. And by the way, you can find all of those great talks online archived today. So definitely check those out, including, shameless plug, my talk on attacking serverless servers. But I just wanted to ask you, just generally speaking, what advice do you have for individuals who'd like to give back to the community and create some kind of cloud conference or security conference, or even cloud security conference in their local area?
There's a lot of opportunities that are there. I know DevOps Days is there. I know there is local chapters you can have, especially with OWASP. There's local chapters. I know, Brandon, you were part of that as well, along with Mark, Gisela, and others. So there are a lot of opportunities you have. But what I would suggest, right, is that especially when you want to give back to the community. Now, Serverless Days, like you said, was a completely nonprofit. We did not do it for profit in that sense. And we had a lot of people come in, fly in from different places. In fact, we had people coming in from outside the country as well and attending the event or speaking at the event. And so there is a large amount of interest in people wanting to know how can they do something in the cloud, or how can they be successful in the area of security. From giving back to the community, what I would say is that there's different opportunities. One would be like a Medium, a blog. You can write articles in the Medium website, or local chapters that are there. You could ask them, hey, can I come and speak about this area that I'm an expert in, or I know much about, or can I? You can work with Amazon, for example, and say, I want to write a blog that you can publish it together, where you can say, here's a way that we've solved this challenge, and I think it'll be helpful for the rest of the world to know about it. So you have these different, including providers, who have the ear of the people to a certain extent for content that they deliver, right? And as you're working with those providers, within your own support agents and others, some of the things that you find enriching or will be helpful for the community, you can partner with them to share that as well. And of course, conferences, speaking at events like you did, I think all of that is very valuable. There's just so many opportunities that are there.
And just one thing to encourage folks about is it doesn't really matter how experienced you are,
Yes.
whether or not you are just starting or you've been doing this for a long time. People are not born public speakers. They're not born people who are able to talk about cloud security publicly. And everybody has a perspective that is valuable, even if you're just getting started. So I definitely think you should try that out sooner than later. It has been by far the most transformative, for the better, thing that I've learned how to do. And you don't have to do it as long as Jabez or I have done it to get into the game. You have so much valuable to share. Everybody has their own perspectives.
Yeah, and people are very supportive, right? And that's the other aspect of it. Sometimes you feel like, man, if I go in front of an audience and say something, and of course you prepare for it, you research it, you apply it, you make sure that what you are doing is, or what you're speaking of is definitely what you've experienced in your own exposure to what you've done. Obviously, all of that is there. But when you are there in front of an audience, right, they're very supportive, because they're there to learn, they're there to hear, and they appreciate you, because they know that, hey, that's an area that I was not thinking about. Oh, I didn't know that you could do that. I didn't know that you were able to do these things and being able to do it efficiently. So and so you also want to see the benefit of sharing your wealth of information to someone else, where now they have that feedback. They are very appreciative. So I think it's definitely a win-win situation.
Absolutely. They're there to learn. They want to learn.
Yes.
And as such, they want you to succeed. Well, Jabez, it has been great having you on the podcast. Where can folks find you online?
I've got a few different ways. I've got LinkedIn, of course. I've got Twitter as well, where sometimes we post for the serverless days and what's coming up and whatnot as well. So and YouTube, there are some presentations I've done for RSA, which has serverless, securing serverless architectures, which is, I'm hoping it's a help to people, and other ones as well. So definitely, if there's areas that they would like to reach out, definitely they can reach out to me. They ping me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Be glad to help us wherever I can. So,
and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So don't worry about that. Well, thanks again, Jabez, for joining. And for those who are listening and enjoyed the topics we covered today, make sure to check out sans.org/cloud for some free cloud security posters, tools, cheat sheets, and more. We're all in a different part of our cloud security journey. You don't become a cloud security architect like Jabez overnight. You have to use a variety of resources. And I hope that you'll check out our job role flight plan to figure out what courses from SANS map to the job role that you're most interested in. So thanks again for joining us on SANS Cloud Ace, Jabez.
So thanks again. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Really enjoyed this discussion and hope it's enriching to others as well. Thank you.